Western Marxism, section War and the Death Certificate of Western Marxism. Reduced to a religion, and indeed a religion of evasion, Western Marxism cannot provide an answer to the problems of the present, particularly the worsening of the international situation. We have seen what has happened in the past few years. On the occasion of the war against Libya in 2011, authoritative organs of the Western press recognized its neocolonial character. Neocolonial and bloody. An eminent French philosopher, very distant from Marxism, observed, quote, "Today we know that the war resulted in at least 30,000 deaths, against 300 victims of the initial repression," end quote, carried out by Gaddafi, end quote from Todorov. According to other estimates, the toll of the NATO intervention would be even greater. And the tragedy continues. The country has been destroyed, and people have been forced to choose between desperation at home or fleeing to the unknown, which could be fatal. I am not aware of any exponent of Western Marxism or of libertarian Western Marxism that has denounced this horror. Indeed, a personality such as Rossano Rossanda, who, as the founder of the communist daily Il Manifesto, can be included in the category of Western Marxism or libertarian Western Marxism, went to the very threshold of calling for armed intervention against Gaddafi's Libya. It is a threshold that Susanna Camuso, Secretary General of the CGIL, a union federation that has left long behind its one-time links to the Communist Party and to Eastern Marxism, happily crossed over. How did we get to this point? At the moment of the outbreak of the first war against Iraq, while the Italian Communist Party was dissolving itself, one of its most illustrious philosophers, Giacomo Maramau, stated in its party newspaper, Unita, on January the 25th, 1991, quote, "Throughout history, it has never happened that a democratic state made war against another democratic state." End quote. In reality, the two countries that love to celebrate themselves as the oldest democracies in the world, Great Britain and the United States, were already at war at the moment of the crisis that resulted in the founding of the North American Republic, and they again clashed a few decades later in another war, the War of 1812, fought with such fury that, as we know, Jefferson called it a war of extermination. Even if we admit that democratic states live side by side in peace with one another, does this make irrelevant the genocide that the Democratic Republic of North America carried out against the native peoples? Or the genocide the British Empire engaged in against the natives of Australia and New Zealand? On the other hand, was it not Tocqueville, the great theoretician of democracy, who revealed the true face of the colonial wars of the liberal democratic West when he called for genocidal practices against the Algerian population? Already refuted by Togliatti at the start of the Cold War, the myth expressed by Maramau makes clear yet again the missed encounter between Western Marxism and the anti-colonial revolution. Let's now go back in time a few years. In 1999, a war unleashed by NATO without authorization by the Security Council of the United Nations did not hesitate to hit civilian targets, nor to destroy Yugoslavia. The nature of this war was very clear to its apologists. Quote, "Only Western imperialism, even if few love to call it by that name, can now unite the European continent and save the Balkans from chaos." And, quote, "What good emerges from Kosovo, cut off from Yugoslavia and become the site of a gigantic US military base, is what the world should now take note of. NATO can and will do everything necessary to defend its vital interests." End quote from J. Fitchett. However, at the start of military operations, a major exponent of Western Marxism dared to write, beginning of long quote, we must recognize that this is not an act of American imperialism. It is, in effect, an international, or to tell the truth, supranational, operation, and its objectives are not guided by the limited national interests of the United States. It is effectively aimed at protecting human rights, or to tell the truth, of human life. End quote from Hart. A year later, Empire announced the good news. It no longer made sense to speak of imperialism as Lenin had. The world was now unified economically and politically. Even, quote, perpetual and universal peace had been assured. This reassuring message was launched while, as we have seen, imperialism was being rehabilitated, explicitly or indirectly. It was a campaign that began with the dissolution of the socialist camp and of the Soviet Union itself, and proceeded to grow on the wave of the wars unleashed by the West in its leading nation, without authorization by the UN Security Council, to demonstrate that no one could resist the sovereign imperial will of Washington and its closest allies and vassals. In the euphoria of those years, the cry of jubilee intersected with the announcement of ambitious programs. The West, as authoritative scholar Barry G. Busan observed in 1991, had, quote, triumphed over communism and third worldism, and so it could calmly remake the world. The year after, the more or less official philosopher of the Western, quote, open society, Karl R. Popper, referring to the ex-colonies, proclaimed, quote, we liberated these states, the ex-colonies, too quickly and too simplistically. It is like abandoning a child care center to its own devices. End quote. For whoever still had not understood, in 1993, the New York Times Magazine, a Sunday supplement of the most important newspaper in the United States, was unable to contain its enthusiasm, as seen in the title of an article written by a British author, Paul Johnson, quote, colonialism's back, and not a moment too soon. End quote. A few years later, in its March to April 2002 issue, Foreign Affairs, a journal close to the State Department, with its title and opening article by Sebastian Mallaby, invited all to give in to the evidence in the existing relations of force. The, quote, logic of imperialism, or better, of neo-imperialism, was too stringent to be opposed. Still further on, a most prominent Western historian, Niall Ferguson, called for creating a, quote, colonial office, modeled on the British Empire and looking at Washington, sang hymns to the most, quote, magnanimous imperial power that has ever existed. End quote. However, this program of colonial and imperial counter-revolution has encountered increasing difficulties. And so today we see increased analysis, discourse, and concern about the rising danger of a large-scale war, of a third world war that could cross the line to become nuclear. One can then understand why the United States has for some time aspired to guarantee itself, quote, first strike capability, and exercise the terrible power of blackmail over the rest of the world. The other countries would then be forced to choose between obedience to Washington or annihilation. This aspiration explains the renunciation by President George W. Bush on June 13, 2002, of the treaty stipulated 30 years earlier that was, quote, perhaps the most important agreement of the Cold War. The United States and the USSR committed themselves to limiting the construction of anti-missile bases, renouncing the goal of nuclear invulnerability and planetary domination that such invulnerability would have guaranteed. The war that the United States is preparing for is against China, the country born of the greatest anti-colonial revolution in history and directed by an experienced Communist Party, or against Russia, which, under Putin, has wrongly, according to the White House, thrown off the neocolonial control that Yeltsin had accepted and adapted to. Thanks to savage and predatory privatization, the West was in fact able to control the immense energy patrimony of the country. This new international situation, thick with dangers, finds Western Marxism completely unprepared. Negri and Hart's announcement of the advent of perpetual and universal peace has reduced them to servility. The discourse of Mao, who identifies democracy with the cause of peace, is subordinate to the Western ideology of war, and can only serve to legitimate the crusade of Washington against China and Russia. Likewise inadequate and misleading is the thesis dear to Harvey of eternal rivalry and, quote, inter-imperialist war. It is certainly not with this category that we can understand the military expeditions by the West, and especially by its leading nation after the triumph in the Cold War, and in a period when the United States was the solitary superpower and absolutely unrivaled. The December 1989 invasion of Panama, the First Iraq War, 1991, the War against Yugoslavia, 1999, the Second Iraq War, 2003, the War against Libya, 2011. In these same years, the United States intervened in Syria to accomplish the regime change that U.S. neoconservatives had called for in 2003. How can we explain why it is only the West, and above all its leading country, the, quote, nation chosen by God, or the indispensable nation, wrapped in its aura of exceptionalism, that arrogates to itself the sovereign and imperial right to intervene in every corner of the globe, even without the authorization of the UN Security Council? To orient ourselves in the present, we need to not lose sight of the anti-colonialist revolution, mostly led by communist parties, that was the main feature of the 20th century, and the unfortunate project of rolling back the anti-colonialist revolution, which is at the center of the so-called neoconservative revolution and of U.S. foreign policy. Born of the horrors of the carnage of the First World War, Western Marxism has shown itself to be unable to understand and oppose the large-scale war that looms on the horizon. It is the death certificate of Western Marxism. End section.